So, Denis Regnier is assistant professor and head of the Department of Humanities and Social Science at the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda, East Africa. As a social anthropologist, he has conducted extensive research in Madagascar. He is the author of Slavery and Essentialism in Highland Madagascar, Ethnography, History, Cognition, which was published this year by Routledge. This book is an important contribution to the study of slavery in Madagascar. In this book, Denis Regnier explores the prejudice against slave descendants in Highland Madagascar and its persistence more than a century after the official abolition of slavery in Madagascar. Denis Regnier shows that the essentialization of the slave descendants perceived as unclean people can be linked to the modes of colonial abolition of slavery in Madagascar. His presentation today is entitled An Incomplete Emancipation, Unintended Consequences of Colonial Abolition in Madagascar. Denis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clara. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I'm really grateful to be given this opportunity to present Joseph C. Miller Memorial Conference at the BCDSS. So I'm going to share my screen, my presentation. So as Clara has just introduced my talk, I'm not going to repeat all of that, but really this talk starts as a sort of follow-up of my book, which has just been published. And this, of course, this book was already the product of my PhD dissertation at the LSE in 2012, so quite a long time ago. I took some time to write the book, not just because it was difficult to write, but also because I went back to Madagascar a few times after my PhD research as a postdoc, and I continued to work and to write about these things. So basically the talk, the conference that I'm going to give today takes this book as a kind of new starting point to rethink and add a few things and a few arguments to some of the ideas and arguments that I have developed in this book. So let me just show you where I did fieldwork to give you a bit of background. It's in Besileo country. It's in the south of Madagascar, in the southern highlands of Madagascar. For those of you who don't know anything about Madagascar, it's a big island, and there is a central chain of highlands. And basically where I was doing field work was in the south of these highlands. So the south of these islands are inhabited by an ethnic group, which is called the Besileo. It's actually an ethnic group. It's a bit complicated because all these ethnic categories have been kind of defined by colonial administration and also maritime administration before. So, but it's today, one of the 18 ethnic groups officially recognized ethnic groups of Madagascar. It's a big group. It's about there are about 2 million. It's a bit less than 10% of the total population of Madagascar. It's one of the biggest group, and they live in the Central Highlands. As I said, it's called Besileo country, if you want. And most of them are peasants who grow rice and raise cattle, zebus. They live in small village and hamlets close to their rice fields, and their social organization, to go very quickly, is based on large named descent groups. So, people have common ancestors and they belong to a group which has a name, and this group can be very large. But of course, for more practical reasons, they are also kind of organized on residential groups in villages around their rice fields and their tombs and so on. So just to give you an idea of the place, This is not where I did field work, but this is a village which is not too far from my field site in the Southern Highlands. You can see small village with the cattle pen there, made with stones. And here you can see in the center of the picture, it's a granary, the small house, brown house in mud. It's a granary for rice. So the people who live there, as I said, are organized in big descent groups. And here you can see one of these groups, which is gathered at the occasion of a ceremony for the ancestors. And they, of course, they have a rich ceremonial life, lots of rituals, lots of practices that are related to ancestorhood and so on. But so one of the things that, just to give you the starting point of all this research, one of the things that surprised me when I arrived there was the fact that among the groups that were living in the area where I did fieldwork, there was a group which had a sort of different status, right? And it took me some time to understand and to, well, I would probably not say discover, but to understand that this group had a history of slavery, right? And it was difficult to understand because people did not talk about it. And when I asked questions about, this issue, because I knew that there were issues about slavery in the region, people didn't want to talk about it because it's a taboo. It's something that you shouldn't, talk openly about, and so on. So it took quite a lot of time. And what surprised me was the fact that, even though these people are not the people here on the picture, it's not the Safe Design group in the picture, but these people I'm talking about, they were called slaves. They were called unclean people, sometimes dirty people, using these very strong expressions. People they were quite rich people. By local standards, they had rice fields, they had cattle, and so on, and they had a ceremonial life just as the others. So it was hard to make a distinction between their life, the way they were living, and the other groups. So basically, what distinguished this group was just that they were called slaves, and of course, the big distinction was that nobody wanted to marry them, right? So the other groups would not intermarry with them, even though, in the region and all the other groups I'm talking about, they were all mixed and allied through intermarriage over generations and generations. So, but this group, and I did a lot of research on this. I did genealogical research. I did some research on the past marriages of the group and so on to find out. And it was quite clear that they never officially married with the other groups, right? So let me just start with the two. These are not the only arguments in the books, but the two arguments are in the book that I would like to talk a bit about today. The first argument, and it's in the subtitle of my book, if you want, is a cognitive argument. I argue that free descendants, so the free descent groups in Besileo, today strongly essentialize the slave descendants, right? Not just this group, the slave descent group that I discovered there, but all the slave descendants in the region. And they seem to think, and this was part of my research, they seem to think that they have a sort of underlying essence that cannot be changed, right? So I call it, following social psychologists and other researchers, I called it a form of social essentialism. And in my book, you will see if you read it that I did some field experiments to try to investigate this issue of essentialism and so on. So I'm not going to talk about this aspect. I'm going to talk about the second argument, which is the historical argument, and the argument that this essentialization is by far, I would say, a consequence of the colonial abolition of 1896. Right. So this colonial abolition happened just before the annexion, just after the annexion of Madagascar by France, right? So in 1895, France annexed Madagascar, conquered Madagascar, and in 1896, 1 year after, they abolished slavery in Madagascar. So very briefly, this argument, because could develop it a bit more, but time is limited. About among the Besileo, the pre-colonial manumission, so the freeing of slaves, traditionally employed, undergoing a ritual cleansing, right, which was performed by a master, the master of the slave, who was most of the time a noble, belonging to the noble stratum, and also by the head of the descent group, where the slave was supposed to be reintegrated after he or she had been freed. So these ritual cleansings were important. And the argument that I made in the book was that the 1896 colonial abolition, the French colonial abolition, had nothing of a ritual cleansing, right? Because the French, well, at least the Besileo, didn't see the French colonial government as having any ritual power, right? So the ritual power was still in the hands of the royalty, the nobles, and to a certain extent in the hands of the heads of the descent groups. But the French colonial government, as a foreign power just arriving in Madagascar, was not seen at all as having this kind of ritual power. So I argue that just after abolition, people viewed the former slaves, the slaves who had just been liberated, as persons who were still unclean. And that's why they called it, I argue, in the Besileo region, Ulutsi Madiu, which means unclean people, right? And the result of this is that they didn't want to marry them after abolition. So there were lots of slaves who had no other option than marrying other former slaves. And these unions, the fact that former slaves had to marry each other, in turn reinforced the prejudice of the free descendants, if you want, against them, right? So this is what I call the process of essentialization of the Andevu slaves in this region. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about too precisely about the argument of essentialism, but the idea that people marry each other is conducive, if you want, to this idea that they are a different kind of people. They appear as a kind of natural kind because they are a bit like they would be another species, another biological species, if you want. Although I don't make this kind of argument, but people view them increasingly as a different type, different kind of people, right? With a sort of different essence. And that's my argument about the essentialization. So this 1896 colonial abolition was a bit special. It was a bit particular because actually it was an abolition that has been rushed. historically. Just to give you the story very quickly, there was a resident governor who was called La Roche, who was in Madagascar as the governor of Madagascar just after the annexion. And he was going to be replaced by the General Gallieni. And he knew that Gallieni was opposed to a quick abolition of slavery. And he had some pressures from some people in France and from the parliament, because the parliament had wanted him to abolish slavery. The abolition of slavery actually had been used as an argument in favor of invading Madagascar. The idea was that for some people, the idea was that Madagascar was a slaving country, and France would liberate the slaves. So there was lots of debate. There were lots of debates about this abolition, but Gallieni was opposed to it because he said that it would add disorder to a difficult situation, which was the new kind of colonial situation. So La Roche decided to abolish slavery just before he left. He signed the decree. The French colonial authorities were completely unprepared, and they did not make any provision for the liberated slaves at that time. And this is interesting because, in comparison or in contrast, the first abolition of slavery in Madagascar was actually decided by the Mariner Queen, Ranavalona, who freed the Masumbika in 1877. The Masumbika were the slaves, the African slaves who had been brought from Eastern Africa to Madagascar. And Clara actually knows the question much better than I do. So this abolition was accompanied by some political measures, right? They were attributed land, and they got a specific status in the Mariner Kingdom. So they were not just left adrift like this in society. When the Queen decided to free them, she gave them a few things, right? Whereas in comparison, the slaves liberated by the French had nothing. It was completely unprepared. It was in a rush. La Roche signed the decree, and from one day to the other, all the slaves in Madagascar were free. So we can kind of imagine that the expectation from colonial authorities was perhaps that this social system, which was found in some societies of Madagascar, not all of them, which had the distinction between nobles, commoners, and slaves, that this kind of hierarchy would disappear by itself, over a few generations. Like the royalty and the nobles were kind of disempowered by the colonial conquest because they had lost, right? And the slave had been all liberated. So I would argue that probably the colonial authorities think that this will kind of as time goes by it will kind of disappear, this kind of traditional authority hierarchy. Sorry. I put in my subtitle, the subtitle of my talk, or my conference, the unintended consequences of abolition. I just want to give you an explanation of where it comes from. In the field of global health, I've read an article by anthropologist Arthur Kleinman from Harvard recently, and he stressed the importance of the social theory of the unintended consequences of purposive or social action, which was initially introduced by a famous sociologist, Robert Merton. So what does this theory say? It's quite simple, but it's an important point, I think. This theory holds that all social and thus political interventions have unintended consequences, some of which can be foreseen and prevented, whereas others cannot be predicted. Some of these unintended consequences can be harmful to people, and if this is the case, we need to understand them in some depth before we can think about the ways of redressing them, right? And of course, Kleinman is writing about, interventions in global health. But when I read this paper, I thought, well, that's actually what I'm trying to do here and in my previous work, try to understand some of the unintended yet harmful consequences of colonial abolition in Madagascar. So let me go over a few shifts that I think, I would argue, happened with the colonial abolition. It's important to stress them because some scholars, some historians of Madagascar have tended to assume that, the colonial abolition did not change things very much, did not change how people thought about slaves and hierarchy and things like that. I would rather disagree with that, and that's why I'm trying to go through these very subtle, but I think very important shifts in the way people have thought. I mean, let me just talk about the demographics, which is not about how people thought, but think. But it's an interesting an interesting question. So before the colonial abolition, it is estimated that there were a total population of slaves, which was roughly equivalent to 500,000. Sorry, a zero is lacking. It's 500,000 slaves, right? So this is a rough estimate. Of course, we don't have robust data, but it's an estimate made by a few historians, and in particular Deschamps, who was an important historian of Madagascar. So he estimated that when slaves were freed in 1896, there were about 500,000 slaves in Madagascar. And that's in a total population of Madagascar of, at that time, was close to 3 million, right? And these are the figures provided by another important historian of Madagascar, Gwyn Campbell, who estimates that in around the turn of the century, there were 3 million Malagasy on the island. So that's quite an interesting figure, because the proportion of slaves was roughly 16%. And after abolition, that's, of course, we don't have, and that's a problem for me, but we don't have many figures about that. But for the Besileo, I can give you some rough estimates. And because an anthropologist, Konrad Kotak, who was working in the 1960s on the Besileo, estimated that in the population in Besileo country, there were about 15% of slaves. And in my own fieldwork, in my own research, I also tried to give an estimate of slaves in the region where I was working, and I've also found about 15%, right? So of course these are very fragile data. We cannot really make an argument about that, but I found it very interesting that if we look at these data, it looks like, the proportion of slaves or people considered as slaves didn't really change, meaning that by this I mean that, if we had found that today there were only 5% of the population or 3% of the population among the Besileo who were considered as slaves, we could have said, oh, actually, yes, there was an abolition, and for some reason, some people are still considered as slaves, but there were many more people enslaved at the time of abolition. So it's kind of would have been a sort of we could have argued that it is a sort of something a leftover, something that is still there, but it's not very important. Whereas, we have these kind of figures that are interestingly, it seems to be the same proportion, right? Another shift which interests me is the sort of the linguistic shift. Before abolition, so the term for slave is rendezvous in Malagasy, right? That's the term, the word that is translated as slave. Before abolition, rendezvous, I would argue, had different meaning, had a different meaning and a different reference. That linguists make this difference between reference and meaning. So the reference of rendezvous was kind of obviously all the people who are currently enslaved. When people were talking about rendezvous, they were talking about people who were in slavery. And the meaning of this term was people who had been captured or sold or enslaved for debt and who were serving a master, right? So there were different explanations as to why some people had been enslaved, but what they had in common is what they were kind of serving a master. Now, after abolition, that's interesting that the word rendezvous, of course, was still in use, right? People continued to talk about rendezvous, but the reference was necessarily different, because when they talked about rendezvous, because slavery had been really abolished, and there was no cases, or there were no cases of people still enslaved after abolition, at least as far as we know. So when they talk about rendezvous, they were talking about former slaves and, importantly, their descendants, right? So the reference was different. So we talk about after abolition, we're talking about former slaves or their descendants. That's very important. And the meaning, to me, it seems, was that rendezvous means people who were not ritually freed in 1896, as I explained to you, and reintegrated. They were not reintegrated into society, right? Or you can also call someone as an rendezvous if this person has one or more of such persons who had not been ritually freed and reintegrated in 1896, right? Among their forebears, among their ancestors. So as time goes by, the meaning of rendezvous is necessarily different. And after abolition, when today, for example, someone say to me, this guy is a slave, what does it mean? So I think these shifts in meanings have been very important. And the other things which has been important is the way people use these words, right? And one thing that struck me when I was reading a folklorist, Pastor Ranifina, who is a folklorist of the Besileo, who has written a few books about the Besileo, he says that among the Besileo, there are not many proverbs, because in Madagascar people use a lot of proverbs when they make speeches and so on. They have no proverbs about the rendezvous, and the reason why they don't have proverbs about the rendezvous is that actually they never use this word, because when they talk about slaves, they use descent group names, right? They actually, the former masters actually gave a group name to their slaves, right? So when they were talking about their slaves, they were always, or about slaves in general, they were using group names like this. So after abolition, I think, as as far as I understand, from what I've been told by local historians and so on, that this word, this phrase, Hulutsi Madiu, unclean people, became to be widespread, right? For the reason I told you, because these slaves were perceived as people who had not been ritually cleansed, right? So Ulutsi Madiu today is probably the most common way of talking about slaves among the Besileo, saying unclean people. But the problem is that it's not always possible to say that, because as I told you already, it's something that you cannot say in public. And the reason why you cannot say it in public is that you are insulting these people, you are insulting their ancestors, and so it's really disapproved by society. And if you are caught talking about people and using the word rendezvous or using the phrase Ulutsi Madiu, you can be fined. You might have to go to the General Assembly and present your excuse and apologize for that, and you have to kill a head of cattle to share with the family which has been insulted and so on. So it's something that people are very afraid of. They don't want to be caught, and so they use a lot of euphemisms, right? They would use things like words like the children, for example. In rituals, it's very often the case that they use the euphemism the children to refer to the slaves, right? So again, the way of how people talk about slaves have changed quite significantly, I think, after abolition. Now, if we talk about the social statuses and in particular the mobility between these social statuses, I tend to think that before abolition, the difference there were more mobility between within the slave stratum, right? Because there were lots of different slaves. There were royal slaves, ritual specialists, and there were also, of course, low status slaves, like people who were cultivating the fields of the noble, who tended the cattle, who cooked, or things like that. And it was possible. I heard stories about that, actually. It was possible for a slave who had a very low status to kind of get promoted as a ritual specialist or a kind of important slave for the noble, the master. So it was possible to achieve some sort of status and mobility as a slave before abolition. And what I found interesting is that the status of these slave, these royal slave, these ritual specialists, was sometimes a status which was regarded as much better, a social situation, a condition which was regarded as much better than the usual commoner condition or status. So they were regarded as kind of wealthy people because they were close to the noble. Their master was a noble, and they were close when they were kind of royal slaves and ritual specialists. And they could also, and that's very important, they could also work and keep part of their earnings, right? So they should, we know that slaves in Madagascar could work, and they had to give a part of their earnings to their master, but they could also keep a part of it. And with this part, they could buy back their freedom to the master, so they could buy themselves back. And it happened. I know a few cases that were told to me that someone that was in the region where I worked. I mean, someone who was dead, but long ago. But the story was still told that he had bought back his freedom and had become a free man again, right? Of course, slaves could be freed by their masters for their good services. After some time, the master would kind of free someone and said, and again perform the cleansing ritual, and sometimes even give them some land and things like that. Slaves could be, of course, bought back by their relatives, their family. Sometimes the family would collect enough money or enough cattle and would ask for their relative to be back in their family. So there were lots of different possibilities to move within the slave stratum, but perhaps more importantly here, outside of the slave stratum. And this is why I think that it was probably not slave status was probably not an essentialized status, as I kind of argue that it is today, because people were always. It was always possible for them to change and come back to the sort of a clean and free status, right? So after abolition, I think that's very different, right? Of course, there is a kind of loss of memory of all the different slaves that existed, the former differences. There are still stories that are told by local historians about how some slaves close to the kings or the nobles had a very high status, but for ordinary people, being a slave means people of the lowest possible status. So the idea of slaves today is conveyed as a sort of that's really what the lowest status that you can have, which was not the case before abolition. And in terms of social mobility today, this is part of my argument. It's really difficult and almost impossible for slaves to escape their status. Of course, ritual cleansing is no longer possible, right? You cannot go to a noble and ask for cleansing if you are considered a slave so that people will see you as a free man. It's not possible to do that. People don't believe that it's possible, right? And the other problem is that the children of someone who is considered as a slave will be considered as a slave, right? This is something which is called in anthropology with the jargon hypodescent rule, which means that the children will take the lowest status among the two parents, right? So if you have one parent who is a slave, either the mother or the father, the children will be automatically considered as slaves. And so the social mobility through intermarriage that you can find, in different places in the world where, someone who could just marry and have their children go up on the social ladder is just impossible for them. It's not this possibility is not open to them. So in addition to this essentialization, the process of essentialization that I just explained to you, I would argue that there was also something which I call, after a philosopher of science, whose name is Jan Hacking, a looping effect, right? So former slaves after abolition, I think, must have been quickly conscious that they were socially categorized as unclean people, and that was the reason why others did not want to marry them. So I think that from that moment on, when they became conscious of the kind of way people thought about them, the classification, the categorization as unclean people, it induced reactions in this classified group, and new ways of being and acting were kind of developed. And this is exactly what Jan Hacking means by looping effect, right? The fact that the classification has an effect on the classified people, and they change the way they behave. So I would argue that, with this consciousness, slaves or former slaves after abolition started to have all sorts of strategies, like migrating from one place to another, leading an itinerant life, as a carpenter, going from village to other village. There is something that I forgot here, but there are also some evidence that former slaves were overrepresented in the groups of bandits in the south of Madagascar. You know that in Madagascar there are this phenomenon that still exists today, which is a brigandry, bandits, cattle rustler, and apparently, but there is a lack of evidence, but apparently former slaves were overrepresented in these bands of bandits, right? So abandoning peasantry to go to the city and to take jobs in different domains, hiding family histories. This is something that has been recorded in different ethnographies, that usually telling about the family history in Madagascar, it's a kind of source of pride. But of course, if you talk to slave descent families, it's a problem, because they want to hide things and tend to dissimulate and so on, because they know that it can be used against them. They also have been strategically using something which is important in Madagascar, which is blood bonds, right? Trying to make kinship relations through blood bonds. That's done through a ritual, and you can do that with all sorts of people, and this is a way of making kin without marriage, right? So they've been doing that quite a lot, it seems to me. Seeking exogamous marriages, meaning that they are trying to they go and they go a bit further than other groups to find partners, because in that way they kind of hope that their origins or their status will not be known. So they travel a lot to find marriage partners and so on. So all these kind of, we could consider, I think, as intentional strategies to kind of to continue the living, after they had been classified as unclean people, made them moving targets, as Jan Hacking says, so it's kind of moving targets for the free descendants. And so in turn, them becoming moving targets provoked new strategies from the part of the free, who try to design new ways of becoming or staying more vigilant about the origins of the people that they marry. They develop social sanctions against people from their group who would decide to try to marry a slave, for example, which now are really ostracized from the group. I already talked about the hypodescent rule. I think it's might be the case that this rule was actually kind of adopted by the free to make sure that their members don't seek to marry a slave descendant. So it's possible to use this looping effect approach to, I think, understand the logics and the dynamics of what happened between these former slaves who are still considered as unclean and unmarriageable, and the others who were kind of trying to make sure and to control and to make sure that they are not going to mix with these people, right? So as a result of these two processes, the process of essentialization and the looping effect, which is also a process because it has been kind of repeated over time. Since abolition, I think that these Besileo slave descendants find themselves today in a situation that I call a post-slavery trap. And why? Why do I use this expression, this phrase? It's just that it struck me that it's similar to what economists call a poverty trap or an underdevelopment trap or a development trap. Sometimes it's a case where self-reinforcing mechanisms cause a condition, for example, poverty, but it could be also discrimination of slave descendants or something like that. And so once this condition exists, these self-reinforcing mechanisms cause them to persist unless there is an outside intervention. In other words, I think that they are kind of trapped. It's really difficult for them. It's really difficult to imagine what they could do to escape their situation. I tried hard to imagine what I would do in that situation, and there is this widespread essentialism that I told you about slaves. They think that people think that they are a different kind of people, and they shouldn't mix with them. There is this high vigilance about origins, and I didn't have time to develop this, but the free descendants make a lot of investigations when they want to marry. There are different ways they can use in the cultural practices, Besileo cultural practices that they can use to try to find out whether their potential marriage partners are actually slave descendants or are considered to be unclean people, right? So these slave descendants, they cannot shed their slave status, whatever they do, they seem to be really trapped. They seem to be stuck. And the only thing that they can do is to leave, of course, Besileo country for good. You just decide to go and say, okay, if this is like this, I'm going to go to another place in Madagascar and live there. But of course, it's not something that is easy to do for everyone. So, you have your family, you have your land, you have your ancestors buried in a tomb, you have everything is there, right? Is in Besileo country. Even if you go to a place in another region of Madagascar to get some money, do some wage labor and so on, the idea is always that you will come back and you will you will spend your the late stage of your life. When you retire, you will go back to your village, and you will be buried in the ancestral tomb and so on. So it's very difficult to do something like that. So for those who cannot do it, there is no way out, right? So for me, and this will be my conclusion. I hope I haven't talked for too long. The Southern Besileo situation is a telling case in post-slavery studies. It shows two things, I think. One, that the colonial abolition actually produced unintended, of course, but harmful and lasting consequences. And also, I think it's a telling case because it challenges the conventional narratives about emancipation from slavery. What it means, and the role that abolition played in that, and so on. So I think it tells another story about abolition and the way to emancipation. So former slaves and their descendants in Besileo country have been trapped into an awkward situation for about 100 years, right? It seems that their emancipation remains to be completed. They are not still free in some way, they are still considered as unclean people, slaves that we cannot marry and so on. They are marginalized and discriminated all the time for that reason. It is really hard to imagine that this situation will improve by itself in the near future, just as I imagine that, people at the time of abolition imagined that it would go, it would kind of disappear by itself. It would die naturally, so to speak, but actually it's not the case. It seems to be there and very, very importantly there. So I think change will have to come from targeted interventions, either from civil society or the state, for example, intervention, advancing social development, education, human rights, and so on, and addressing actually the issue of the discrimination against slaves in Madagascar. Thank you for your attention.